Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Tuesday, May 7th, and we are going to be touching on the NBA playoffs as we have been these past couple days. Last night we got a couple games with some pretty surprising outcomes, with the Minnesota Timberwolves dismantling the Denver Nuggets, taking a 2-0 series lead headed back to Minnesota. So we're going to be diving into that game and that series. We also got the Knicks taking game one against the Indiana Pacers in a pretty wild finish there. So we're going to be talking on both of those games. We also got some interesting comments from Miami Heat president Pat Riley in his exit interview. Held a press conference yesterday and did not mince words for some star players of the Heat in Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero. So we're going to be looking a little bit ahead to the Heat offseason. I know we talked about this a bit the other week, but just sort of revisiting that conversation and talking about how these new comments from Riley sort of tie into that greater picture. And then finally, we are going to be ending off the show with a little NFL talk. There was a new report that just came out surrounding Kirk Cousins and his departure from Minnesota to Atlanta, and how this interesting conversation surrounding the drafting of his replacement sort of plays into this whole situation. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. Starting off, though, we have to talk about the shocking finish of the Timberwolves, not just beating the Nuggets to take a 2-0 series lead, but absolutely tearing them apart with their dominant win last night. They end up winning 106-80. That was the least amount of points that the Nuggets have scored all season long, and the Timberwolves did so without even their defensive anchor of Rudy Gobert. So this was a very surprising result in my eyes after dropping game one in Denver. It seemed like this was going to be a prime spot, especially given the fact that Gobert is not out with an injury, but he was present for the birth of his son, so he wasn't able to participate in this game, and this felt like a nice spot for them to sort of respond, and they did quite the opposite. This was the most human I think we have seen Nikola Jokic in this past, call it a 2-year stretch, where he just looked so uncomfortable, and he did look, I guess, slightly more comfortable if you at least look at the box score in game one, but, at the same time, still did not look to fully be himself. Had 7 turnovers in that game, had another 4 in this game, making 11 in the first 2 games of the series, scored just 16 points on 5 of 13 from the field. He was blocked 4 times in this game, which is something that definitely stood out to me. The fact that they were meeting him with, typically, when we watch Nikola Jokic play basketball, in large part for him, obviously he prefers to get his teammates involved, have it be more of a team-oriented game, and not have to be the, focal point of the offense from a scoring perspective necessarily. And he was trying to be a little bit more aggressive in this game, working himself into the paint with Rudy Gobert out. And Naz Reid blocked him twice in one possession. Mike Conley got to Jokic at one point off of some help defense. So it was a really rough game for Jokic. And again, these turnovers, they're just sloppy decisions here at times and just not careful with the ball himself. So obviously Jokic, he still rounds out his stat line to be solid, where scores 16 points, grabs 16 rebounds, and dishes out 8 assists. So, again, this is just the fact that he looks human. He looks mortal, and really, it's just the size of Minnesota has been such a disruptor for the type of game that he wants to play. And Jokic obviously isn't the only one struggling in this series. Jamal Murray was just straight up in jail last night, where he could not get anything going, and concerns are definitely rising about him some. He scored 8 points on 3 of 18 from the field, 4 turnovers to his 2 assists, and he hasn't really looked right all playoffs long. Now, he had the couple buzzer beaters against the Lakers, or game winners, I should call it. One of them was an official buzzer beater. But for Murray, it just seems like he's definitely not fully comfortable. And yes, of course, he's dealing with the calf injury from the Lakers series. But I feel like this series, it's not even so much about him not being 100%. It's just the type of defense that Minnesota plays with the amount of length that they can throw at him is just totally taking him off of his spot. And this is a Nuggets team that doesn't necessarily have sort of those secondary players to help contribute. And that being said, Michael Porter Jr. was of course incredible in that Lakers series, averaging 23 points per game as a third option. But when it comes down to this Nuggets offense, it really does sort of rely on Murray to also be there. And he's shooting just 38-29 shooting splits in the postseason so far. And last night was the worst of them yet, where it wasn't just the level of production from him, but it was his demeanor, where there was a point he was just, it almost looked like he was just fed up with even trying to be an aggressor. He got Karl Anthony Towns switched out on the perimeter. Aaron Gordon was looking to swing it back to him. He had one of those Minnesota wings, but either Jaden McDaniels or Nickeil Alexander-Walker on him, and he was looking to give it back to Jamal, who should have at least, the speed advantage and be able to work Karl Anthony Towns on the perimeter, and Murray just sort of waved him off and, forced Aaron Gordon to take a tough drive. He ends up missing the layup, but it was definitely a moment that stood out to me, and for Murray, again, his demeanor was just terrible. He spent the majority of the game arguing with the referees. He was at one point yelling over to the announcers, trying to sort of make sense of how this game was playing out. And it was definitely a physical game. The refs were letting a lot slide. That did definitely benefit the Nuggets to some degree, with Murray and his constant talking, as well as Mike Malone getting right in the face of one of the referees after that Anthony Edwards drive that saw Kentavious Caldwell-Pope end up going down. Looked like he might have gotten kneed in the groin there. But Murray was just kind of unhinged last night, and it was further displayed when he ends up throwing a heat pack onto the court from the sideline, from the bench that is. And we'll see how this plays out. Feel like it's going to at least be a fine, but Murray could potentially be facing a suspension in Game 3, and just such a crucial point where they really can't afford that at this time. And it was just a disaster for the Nuggets all night long. He and Jokic combined for 8 of Denver's 16 turnovers. The Nuggets had just as many turnovers as they did assists, which is just so uncharacteristic for this Nuggets team that has been on an incredible run the past couple seasons. And I guess you could say the Nuggets haven't necessarily had to deal with too much adversity in these past couple years. I think it's pretty clear that the Timberwolves are the best team. This year's version of the Timberwolves are the best team the Nuggets have had to face in the postseason the past couple years. And they, of course, played the Timberwolves in the playoffs last year, but it was a year younger of Anthony Edwards. He wasn't quite as refined as he is. They were still working on their chemistry with the double big situation of Towns and Gobert. There was definitely less maturity with Towns. Kyle Anderson and Gobert were fighting leading into the playoffs. They had no Jaden McDaniels, so it was all kind of a mess for Minnesota headed into the playoffs last year. And now they are definitely back with vengeance. And, for them to have a chance to redeem themselves after a disappointing Game 1 loss and respond like this just shows that they are currently uncomfortable with the idea of playing through adversity. And, let alone the fact that they had this opportunity without one of the Timberwolves starters and most important defensive player. Just shows, I feel like you could maybe actually debate a little bit. I think Gobert is the most impactful, but Jaden McDaniels has shown that even when his offense isn't clicking necessarily, he is such an impactful player for them on that defensive side of the ball. And we're going to get into the Timberwolves a little bit more here as we go on. But on the side of the Nuggets here, like I mentioned, Malone was pretty unhinged as well and wasn't able to keep his composure. The fact that he didn't even get a technical for getting up in the referee's space like that, you could say the refs sort of were very lenient with the way that the Nuggets were playing this game and sort of gave them an opportunity to, steal this game back. But they were in their own heads. They were not checked into the game, and ultimately it wasn't even close for them. It seemed like they had no real pride, and I do wonder if part of this could have to do with the fact that this Gobert factor almost played into the Timberwolves' hands, where they were looking to make their adjustments on a couple days rest. They thought of some different ways that they could potentially attack Minnesota's defense, and then all of a sudden he is ruled out at game time. And I'm definitely not trying to make any excuses, just talking this out here. You saw Jokic, when you talk about the sloppiness with him, it was in the first couple minutes of the game where Kyle Anderson was starting in place of Gobert. Timberwolves decided to go a little bit smaller, and Jokic went to post up Kyle Anderson, and he just poked it straight out of Jokic's hands, which led to a transition opportunity for the Timberwolves. Timberwolves have been a team that has been really good at scoring off of other teams' turnovers, and last night was another example of this. And again, no excuses for the Nuggets. You have to take advantage of that, but I do wonder if there was a sort of coaching element of this game where they were trying to adjust to something that wasn't necessarily there. And when Minnesota, they play very different when they don't have Gobert and they have to go a little bit smaller. Now, there are times they still balance the Naz Reid and Karl Anthony Towns defensive lineups, but it's just interesting. Offensively on the other end as well, they are able to space the floor out more, I should say. And, ultimately, just none of it was working for the Nuggets in this game. And the fact that Gobert wasn't in this game and the Timberwolves were still so dominant did have me thinking a little bit. And obviously, Timberwolves are focused on this season right now, finishing out the playoffs here. We saw their championship odds really jump. They are now the second favorites in terms of NBA Finals champion odds on DraftKings. They are now plus 320, only behind the Boston Celtics, obviously number one in the Western Conference. And in terms of a series perspective here, they are now minus 525 to close out the Nuggets in this one, which is just crazy the way that this has shifted in the past few days. But I did, again, just want to very briefly go over this thought experiment of what do the Timberwolves look like long term. We obviously know that Anthony Edwards, just 22 years old, he is the building block. He's making his argument for being a top 5 player in the league, potentially being the face of the league in the years to come. So they have him, Karl Anthony Towns, and Jaden McDaniels all locked down for the next handful of seasons. They have Mike Conley, who is going to be an expiring free agent after this year. Or he is an expiring free agent, so he's going to be on the open market come this offseason. I feel like Conley would be sort of willing to play ball a little bit and allow himself to make maybe a little bit slightly under market value as long as the Timberwolves do still pay him. And the Timberwolves do have the money to, so, lock him up for another couple years. Again, we'll see there. I do feel like he's sort of an underrated piece to this Timberwolves team. But I really wanted to sort of talk about the conversation surrounding Gobert and Naz Reid, where they both have player options entering the 2025-26 season. And Naz Reid is absolutely going to decline that in my eyes, and I know that that's probably not something that Timberwolves fans want to hear because of the fact that Naz Reid is such a hometown favorite, but he is making just under $13 million this year. He'll be making just under $14 in 2024-25. This is the now, of course, named the Sixth Man of the Year. He is going to want to get some more money than what he's currently making. Gobert is going to be a little bit more of an interesting conversation because at that point he'll be something along 34 years old. Is he going to be able to? I would imagine he probably declines that as well, as long as he's still the caliber of defender he is or close to it. He has a chance to make $46.6 million in the 25-26 season, but I say all of this to lay out the fact that, we've seen this Timberwolves defense become an absolutely elite group, the best in the NBA, and Karl-Anthony Towns, the whole reason they sort of brought Gobert in the first place is because Towns was not a great defender, and he showed that he is very capable of it last night, and in general, through the course of the year, it feels like he is more competitive, or more committed, I should say, on that defensive end. Now, fouls, definitely still an issue with him, but ultimately, I do think that they could also sort of run this forward here with Naz Reid instead of Rudy Gobert if they want to sort of cut down on some money in that instance. And the future is absolutely bright for the Timberwolves. I'm not breaking any news here, but when you talk about the idea of this being a team that is going nowhere, I definitely feel like they are in an incredible position moving forward with or without Rudy Gobert. And we saw how even without him last night, they didn't lose their identity. They know who they are. They are just so connected on that defensive end. And then, of course, they have the offensive star in Anthony Edwards. And Karl-Anthony Towns has also been incredible through these first two games as well. The two of them both scored 27 points last night. And again, just the reason I bring all of this up is to talk about the idea of the longevity of this group and the core that they have. Rudy Gobert was the piece that was sort of supposed to be inserted into to give them championship aspirations, and that has worked. But it feels like their window should last so much longer than just Gobert's contract with this team. So I think that as much as they gave up, you can definitely argue. I think it's getting harder and harder by the day to argue that the Timberwolves gave up too much for Rudy Gobert. It was an absolutely massive haul in order to get him, but if they get at least one championship out of this, it's hard to say. You can't say that it was a mistake. You can say it was maybe a little bit of an overpay, but at the same time, championships is what it's all about, and it seems like they are sort of knocking on the door of being in that realm. So wanted to just sort of run through that really quick. But other final thoughts here on the game. Definitely doesn't help the Nuggets that they don't have necessarily a second unit that has quite as much oomph to it in terms of being able to know exactly what their role is and slide into this situation and have success. Where, there was a pretty awesome moment of the Peyton Watson chase down block against Jaden McDaniels, but on the whole as a season, we have seen that the non-Jokic minutes haven't been very good for them. It has been an issue. But last night, their starting group was getting worked too, which only makes things worse when it comes to that second unit because you don't have anybody that's going to come off the bench and necessarily lead the charge for them. Reggie Jackson is still dealing with this ankle foot injury as well. Justin Holiday was actually, their third leading scorer last night off the bench. So I don't know, maybe they could find something there. He got red hot from three, but a lot of those points sort of coming when the game was already over. And that's the thing is late in these first quarters, third quarters, when the bench units start to come in, it's not like Minnesota has the deepest bench in the world necessarily, between Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Naz Reid, but they're both very impactful players that know exactly what they are supposed to do, and last night they had an impact, undoubtedly. Final notes here. First quarter, Aaron Gordon was almost the leading scorer for the Nuggets. He scored 13 in that first quarter. Only player that topped that in the entire game was Nikola Jokic with 16. And early on, when this was a potential game, felt substantial. The fact that he was knocking down some threes, which would be huge for them. He was trying to take a little bit more advantage of a smaller Minnesota team, and it ultimately meant nothing. Gordon actually ended up with the lowest plus-minus on the Nuggets at minus 33, and just really was not impactful after that first quarter. And, it was just a blowout from there. They gained the 20-point lead in the second quarter. It was hovering around the 30-point mark for a lot of the game. So it was the Timberwolves absolutely dominating this. I did want to briefly touch on this idea of a lot of people, and it feels like Suns fans specifically, are asking for apologies from everybody about the fact that they were swept in this series, and sort of the other side of the coin is, should we feel worse about the LA Lakers, the fact that the Nuggets, who have absolutely owned them the past couple years, are now in this type of a hole? I'm not really on board with the whole revisionist history 2 games into the next series. I feel like with the Suns on this side of the argument, the issue with the Suns is that no matter how good the Timberwolves are, the Suns had fatal flaws that were clear pretty much all year long, and that's what ended up hurting them in the postseason. The fact that they were so reliant on their starters. They did not have a bench, and things only got worse there, of course, when Grayson Allen went out with injury, but they also didn't really have the legs to close out games. They were the worst fourth quarter team in the league. Seemed like they let a lot of these games against the Timberwolves get away from them in the third quarter. They're restricted so much from a financial standpoint. I'm not apologizing to Suns fans, and I'm sorry, but I feel like, again, if they were to have faced the Nuggets, do you really expect anything to have been much different? I don't personally. And, from the Lakers' perspective of this, I don't feel like they should be getting any more heat than when they lost to the Nuggets the first time around. I thought the Nuggets were objectively the better team. They were the better coach team. And I still don't think that they're bad. Everybody's acting like the fact that this happened shows that the Lakers, lost to this team that isn't that good, when the reality is they are the reigning champs. They spent the majority of the year as the second favorites to win the finals, and I'm still not ready to fully count them out. I know that the odds are very much stacked against them, and chances are that it is the Timberwolves closing this out, but, at the same time, I think they have the best player in the NBA in Nikola Jokic, who led the Nuggets to 2 3-1 comebacks in the 2020 playoffs. Now, that was during the bubble, so the Nuggets didn't have to go on the road. Now they're going to go and pretty much have to steal both games in Minnesota. Obviously, at least one of them, but you don't want to be in that 3-1 hole. Now, they have until Friday to sort of recollect themselves and get themselves together, but obviously, odds stacked against them. Like I mentioned, Wolves are now minus 525 favorites in opposition to the Nuggets being plus 400. So I definitely, you have to credit the Timberwolves. They are in prime position here to take this home, but it's not like it's this completely unprecedented waters that the home team could drop both of their first 2 games and end up winning the series. I know that in 2021, we saw the Clippers drop both of their games in LA and still able to win that series in 7. I know in 2017, I believe it was, the Boston Celtics lost the first 2 games to the Chicago Bulls, and they were able to pull off the comeback, won 4 straight games there. So odds are absolutely stacked against them, but I'm not ready to fully abandon the idea that the Nuggets could come back in this series. But let us know in the comment section what you feel on this series, and any sort of big picture takeaways from what you've seen in these first two games. But on that note, we are going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other end, I want to dive into the other playoff game we got from last night with the New York Knicks and Indiana Pacers. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose, if it's some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be talking about the other game that we had going on last night in the NBA, and that was the New York Knicks and Indiana Pacers. They end up closing that game out in the final couple minutes, winning 121 to 117. So I want to just sort of get my thoughts out of the way here. I hate talking about the referees in games because I do fully believe that the outcome of a game cannot be fully determined by the referees. You play, however many minutes. It is a very long game, and I don't think that any individual calls can ultimately cost you the game. That's how I felt in the last Knicks series when 76ers fans were mad about the results of Game 2. But if there is going to be a direction, again, all of this is so stupid to even talk about, but I would at least prefer, refs to sort of swallow their whistles than, overcall things. And last night, it felt like we were getting such an awesome game, and the referees, I wouldn't say they ruined it fully because it was still a great competitive game, but they were just way too involved down the stretch. And I don't know if I've really seen a worse call than that kickball violation against Aaron Nesmith in the final minutes there. That was, I think it was in the final minute exactly, and that was going to lead to a steal. Yeah, it was with 52 seconds left. That was going to lead to a steal for Indiana. The game was tied at that point, and then instead the Knicks get to reset. Dante DiVincenzo ends up hitting a three that really sort of gave them the lead that they were able to hold on to for the rest of the game. Now, again, get the stop there, and we're not even talking about that individual play. Reality is Jalen Brunson has just been such a demon in these playoffs that he drops 40 points again. It was 43 to be exact, his fourth straight game with 40 or more points in the playoffs, so you absolutely have to credit him. And in that situation, because of the fact that Brunson was just dealing so much, the Pacers sort of had to collapse in on him, opens up the shooter, and that's that. Get the stop, not having the conversation. But I thought that was horrendous. And then the illegal screen, it's sort of similar to the situation when we saw Iowa UConn in the women's tournament during March. An illegal screen is an illegal screen at any moment in the game. Now, Dante DiVincenzo absolutely sold it extra, which I do feel like the Knicks do tend to sort of play up these calls a little bit extra, which just, from an ethical hoops perspective, does rub me a little bit the wrong way. But At the same time, Miles Turner was moving. So I don't like the call. I understand it, and I don't think that you can fully get mad at it and say that the referees carried the Knicks to this win. I just hate that we're even talking about the referees, and I know that I'm the one doing it, but it's because it was so prominent last night in the last couple minutes of what, again, was a tremendous game. And a game that if you're a Pacers fan, you got to be feeling sick to your stomach a little bit because it felt like this was in their control for the majority of this game, where specifically it was at the end of the first quarter and the end of the third quarter when those bench units came in. It was just such a difference maker for Indiana. And this is what I talked about as one of the keys to the series is we know the reality is the Knicks are not that deep. And Tom Thibodeau, who has a reputation of not necessarily going deep into the bench in his, coaching career in general, talk about a playoff series in particular, he's running these guys pretty much to the bone in his starting lineup where Josh Hart played every single second of this game. You got DiVincenzo with 44, Brunson with 44, Anunoby with 42 minutes. So these bench minutes are going to be crucial for the Pacers, and they got some standout performances from their bench unit. Obi Toppin and TJ McConnell, I've been giving them their praises through the Milwaukee series, and it was fun seeing Obi Toppin. I mean, the man is a psycho for attempting that through the legs dunk in transition, but it ends up going, so it's a cool moment. But, I mean, what an anxiety inducer for Rick Carlisle that must have been. And we've seen Toppin miss these types of plays in the past. I believe he even had one against Milwaukee as well. But, they were great. The two of them combined for 30. Then you got some Isaiah Jackson minutes where he wasn't even a part of their lineup, really. He only played 6 minutes per game against Milwaukee. He did not play in games 2 and 3, and he came in. He was really impactful in this one on the boards for sure, but it was more than that too. Defensively, he was making his impact as well, and then Ben Shepherd got hot a little bit offensively there as well. So by the end of it, they end up with 46 bench points in comparison to the Knicks scoring just 3. And those bench minutes were what put them up late in the fourth quarter, but they weren't able to hang on. And, like I said, you can absolutely, if you're a Pacers fan, feel like you got slighted a little bit by the referees in this game. But another massive part of this story of this game is the fact that you look back to the in-season tournament and Tyrese Halliburton was being put in these conversations with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and the other top point guards in the league, and it sort of feels like offensively from an individual scoring perspective, it was a little bit of an aberration. Now, I don't think that people are necessarily fully appreciating the playmaking that Halliburton is able to put on. And last night actually only 8 assists, which felt like he had more than that, honestly. But Halliburton was also contributing some on the defensive end. I didn't think he had a bad game by any means, but this is a scenario where you have two very different team philosophies, where the Knicks, I feel like, are very much Jalen Brunson oriented, and he has come through and delivered time after time to begin these playoffs. He did so the entire regular season, and when they need a tough bucket, it's Jalen Brunson going out there. When you look back to when the in-season tournament was happening, Tyrese Halliburton was that go-to guy in crunch moments, but he just has not been the same since then. His shooting splits are way down post All-Star break. I've already talked about all of the numbers surrounding this in the past, so I'm not going to dive into it fully again. But taking just 6 shots in this game, and 5 of them coming from the perimeter. I know that he's big into driving and kicking out, but he's just not an aggressor. And, that was what made this Pacers team seem like a more formidable postseason opponent. And they're still in the second round, so I'm definitely not trying to downplay them by any means. But they don't necessarily have that crunch time scorer, and it's absolutely hurting them. So Halliburton, really nice player, but looking back on just those conversations that were being had at mid-season, it's really tough to look back on if you're a Pacers fan and think, well, what if he was that same level of player? Because Halliburton, contributes a little bit more offensively in this game, and I think that the Pacers easily win. And again, in those sort of clutch half-court situations, Halliburton was killing other teams at the time, and he's just incapable of doing that now. So, Pacers end up dropping this game. I did think it was really fun to sort of watch the, one-on-ones that were going on between Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby. Of course, teammates on the 2019 Raptors championship team. And they had a nice little back and forth going where Siakam was definitely looking to post up OG a handful of times. He wasn't necessarily, extremely involved in the transition game like he usually is, but he was hitting some tough shots out of the post-ups against OG, and it just seemed like, somebody said this on Twitter, but, it was like getting an inside look on some of those one-on-ones the two of them must have been running for years when they were in Toronto together and, practicing against one another. It was just very fun to watch there. But, ultimately, I thought that one of the biggest takeaways, at least in my eyes, for this game was the fact that the Pacers do have this innate ability to sort of draw the opposing team into playing their style of pace, which, there was a comment from Josh Hart during, I believe it was the intermission going from the first quarter to the second quarter, he was asked about the pace, and he said this is the type of pace that we want to play. Now, Hart was actually doing a really good job of running the transition game for New York, but I don't think that that is the pace that New York wants to play in. They are extremely well conditioned, and you have to give, the players and Thibodeau, because there's clearly an emphasis on that when this team practices, that we need to be ready to go from a physical conditioning standpoint. And it was definitely clear that, they were up to the challenge, but it does feel like at some point this is going to be something that is going to hurt the Knicks in the long run. The fact that, especially if through this series and, the Pacers, I think that Rick Carlisle has done a really good job. It's instilling that they themselves have to push, but they also were running all of these full court press looks. They were doing so off of misses, off of makes, off of, just regular inbounds in the full court, and sort of forcing the Knicks to run a little bit more, be more physical in the full court situation. And it seems like we could see the Knicks break down a little bit over time, but at least in game one, they were willing to step up to the challenge. Now, if I'm Tibbs, I'm probably trying to look to slow down the game a little bit more, at least, from the Knicks perspective of this, and you do what you can to limit the Pacers, but at the same time, it's very hard to do so. I did think it was interesting when you look at the rebounding numbers from last night, the fact that the Pacers were the ones that, especially early on in this game, were a lot more involved on the offensive glass. Now, the Knicks sort of started bringing a little bit more of that energy as the game went on. Specifically, Isaiah Hartenstein was really impressive with this. Josh Hart as well grabbed 4 offensive rebounds himself. So, things did sort of start to default back to the sort of averages, but I wonder if that was partially due to the fact that Thibodeau is putting so much emphasis on the Knicks trying to get back off of a miss in order to make sure that the Pacers can't run the full court, the transition game and pushing the pace and all of that. So just something that I feel like there is going to be a little bit of a chess match between the coaches in this series in terms of what pace are these games going to be played at, because it can be very difficult, if you're the Knicks on this, to try and run this slow, deliberate offense while the Pacers are looking to get up court every second they feel like they have a lane. But Something that stood out to me, again, thought they stepped up to the challenge in game one, but especially knowing that they're not going to rely on their bench quite as much, it is definitely a conversation. We saw, again, basically a 7-man rotation from New York in this game. Precious Achiuwa did get a little bit of playing time in the first quarter, but did not check it back in after that. So ultimately, again, really fun game. Wish the refs were maybe a little bit less involved down the stretch, but I don't think that people were necessarily giving this series the credit I thought it deserved headed into it because of that bench impact. Now, again, are you going to be getting 46 points from your bench? That is a super tough ask if you are Rick Carlisle and Indiana, but one way or another, that is an advantage. And their starting lineup is no slouches either. We saw the way that they were able to pull the Knicks into their game, but the late game execution just was not good enough. So I think that, this is probably a Knicks and 6 series here. Now, again, maybe you're a Pacers fan and you're feeling even worse about them because of the fact that that seemed like it was a great opportunity to steal that game and they weren't able to do so. But I'm definitely not out on the Pacers still anyways. I expected this game to go a little bit of the distance, but I think that it's going to come down to, in large part, the fact that the Knicks have the best player in the series by far in Jalen Brunson, and he showed that again last night. But let us know in the comment section what your thoughts on the game last night were and what your expectations for the series moving forward are. We are now going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into some interesting comments from Miami Heat president Pat Riley on some of his star players. So stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our third segment of the day, and I wanted to talk about the comments made by Pat Riley during the Miami Heat's exit interview, where he spoke out against some of the Heat's top players in Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero in response to this season. Obviously, the Heat with a little bit of a disappointing exit yet again from the playoffs in the first round. Well, I wouldn't say again necessarily, because last year they were just in the finals, so that's definitely unfair of me to say, but I would say at least an underwhelming regular season, which is I think what this sort of the frustration of Riley boils down to, is the fact that they have been 8 seeds each of the past 2 years, and yes, they were able to put together their finals run last season, but it did, I feel like that's not a recipe for success. This is what I talked about when the Heat were eliminated the other week, that they cannot feel like they can just coast through all of these regular seasons year after year, knock off the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, and put together this Cinderella type run where this year they put themselves in another bad position. And in that play-in game is where Jimmy Butler ends up getting the MCL injury, and he's unable to go for the first round against the Celtics. And from there is where Pat Riley sort of took issue with Jimmy Butler. And again, I do think it's a little bit boiled into some of the frustrations with the lack of care for the regular season. But Pat Riley came out and had a quote saying, "If you're not on the court playing, you should keep your mouth shut," in regards to Jimmy Butler, who he posted after the Heat ended up winning that Game 2 against the Celtics. He went on social media, posted the picture of him photoshopped onto Jalen Brown's body using the quote from last year's playoff, "Don't let us get one." And then it was early in that Game 3 matchup in Miami. Butler was on the sideline doing an interview, sort of talking some more trash, saying, "Oh, well, if I have to hear about Boston again, yada yada." And the whole series went downhill from there. And then he recently was, I'm not even sure exactly where he was, but he was with Rock the Bells, which is some sort of media company or something. I fully apologize if I'm not giving you the respect you deserve, but he was talking to someone there and said that the Celtics would absolutely be eliminated if Jimmy Butler were playing, and same with the New York Knicks, which not really sure how he could have eliminated two teams in the first round if he were healthy, but that's besides the point. And Pat Riley just sort of seems like he's a little bit sick of the, gimmick with Jimmy Butler. And Butler was so massive, obviously, for the Miami Heat. He's led them to multiple finals since coming to Miami, but it's just, there is a lot of talk there for maybe, and again, I hate having the conversation of, oh, well, if you don't deliver a championship, you're not allowed to talk. I think that that's one of the stupidest, types of ideas that NBA fans come up with. It's been impressive what he's done in Miami, but we've seen a real lack of care from him in terms of being available on the court. Talked about he has yet to play more than 64 games since he has come to Miami, and it's almost like he's celebrated at times because he just doesn't care at all about the regular season. But again, it puts his team in much more difficult situations where, even if you go back to last year, and I've referenced this multiple times already on the show in the past couple weeks, but the fact that they almost lost that game to the Chicago Bulls in the game for the 8th seed in last year's playoffs, where they trailed late in the fourth quarter, but they were able to come back, and obviously it's forgotten because they end up moving on to the NBA Finals, but they just shouldn't even be in those positions. And this is a very prideful Heat organization, Heat culture, of course, and Pat Riley has been with the Heat for decades now. He knows what it takes to be a championship caliber team, and Eric Spoelstra is one of the best coaches in the NBA. And the fact that they have been so limited during the past couple regular seasons goes to show that there has been a lack of emphasis on the regular season, which, again, we're talking about the NBA here. It feels like year by year people care less and less about the regular season, but we are seeing sort of some of the downsides surrounding it. A smaller example, but the Orlando Magic, if they had home court advantage against the Cleveland Cavaliers, very easily could have come out of it. And that's a team that, they overachieved, and it's not by any means lack of care for the regular season in that instance. But there are still these situations where the regular seasons do have implications on the postseason, and that was definitely the case with the Heat this season. But it wasn't just Jimmy Butler that he was talking about, because Tyler Hero is another one of these Heat players that we know there is plenty of talent there, but they has not necessarily been available in the past year and a half, and maybe that is unfair to say, because last year, it was Hero dealing with the injury through the playoffs, and this year he missed a ton of time as well, was only able to play in 42 games, and he was at least available come the postseason. But Pat Riley didn't hold back on him either, and was asked about his injury history and said that he called him fragile. Like, as a quote, he called him fragile and said that he needs to make some adjustments. So the Heat are in a very interesting situation where we know that there is a level of talent there. I mean, on paper, you look at having Jimmy Butler along with an all-star, an all-NBA potentially caliber player, an all-NBA defender for sure in Bam Adebayo. And then you have some other interesting pieces in Tyler Hero, Terry Rozier, who they just went out and traded for, and some potential young guys that could end up developing for them in Jaime Jaquez and Nikola Jovic. But I'm not sure necessarily how close they are to being a true finals contender. And it's also going to be interesting with this conversation surrounding Jimmy Butler, where he wants a max contract. He is under contract for the entire 2024-25 season, but has a player option in 2025-26. I feel like he's likely going to decline that. He's going to be, I believe, 36 years old headed into that season, and he's going to want to cash out one more time. But when you look at Butler's availability for the Heat the past couple of years, and obviously, the whole playoff Jimmy Butler, I mean, I'll say this, he's obviously been a playoff riser in some of these instances, but it was almost a little bit overblown last year, and, he was great. Again, like I said, I don't think that it needs to be ring or bust in terms of what your legacy means, but his first round series really sort of diluted the reality of, the level of play that he had during the playoffs, and he was great. And already I feel like I'm being too negative on him in this situation, but after the first round, he was just kind of what we know Jimmy Butler for, which is a really good player, but can he be a number one player on a championship team? Obviously, when he comes alive and he's averaging 35 against the Bucks, it seems that way, but playoffs are a long thing. It's a long 4 rounds, and maybe it speaks to he needs more talent around him to help him get to the finals without being worn down, but I definitely thought that he looked worn down by the time that they did play the Nuggets, and ultimately, the Nuggets were just a different class than the Heat were in that series. So it's going to be interesting to see how they monitor that situation coming into the offseason, where, I mean, to some degree, they have a potential to go out and get a star player. A lot of people recently have been pointing to the idea of Donovan Mitchell or Kevin Durant, which for them, I feel like it would definitely be worth investing into. Now, the issue is, what kind of assets do they have? I believe they have their own draft capital, which is definitely a positive for them, but it's similar to this conversation when they were trying to trade for Damian Lillard last offseason, a package, and now granted, Jaime Jaquez Jr. has shown some more, Nikola Jovic as well. I don't know, though, if Jaquez, Hero, and Jovic get either one of those deals done. Definitely not the Kevin Durant deal. Now, Mitchell, if he comes out publicly or at least to the front office and says, I am not picking up my player option for the 25-26 season, I am not re-signing here in Cleveland, he could tank his value a little bit, and at that point the Cavs might just take a discounted price for the sake of getting something in return for him. But even if that's the case, I don't know. I mean, Tyler Hero, I feel like hurt his stock with his postseason performance. Now, some of Game 2 was great for him. It was one of the best games we've seen from Hero. But defensively, he was just a total turnstile. The Celtics were looking to hunt him on just about every possession he was out on the court. And I don't think that he can be a centerpiece. And then when you look at, Jaquez and Jovic, they're nice additional players, but when you're giving up an all-NBA caliber guy, you feel like you want at least, potential to be an all-star, and I just don't know if necessarily any of those players are there. Now, I do love Jaime Jaquez Jr., and I feel like he can absolutely be a contributor on a contending team, maybe like an elevated version of the impact that Christian Brown had for the Nuggets last year, but I'm not really sure. And the Hero contract is still very expensive moving forward. There's 3 more years on it, making at least $29 million in each of the next 3 seasons. So it's only going to get more expensive for teams. Helps match up the contracts some, but again, in terms of the individual trade value of Tyler Hero, I just don't know how much the Heat can necessarily go out and fetch for that. So I guess, and if you were, I don't know, the idea has also been thrown out about them potentially trying to blow it up. I don't know necessarily what there is to blow up. I suppose you could trade Jimmy Butler to try and get something. Tyler Hero, again, as well. I don't think that he has great value necessarily, but maybe you could fetch something in return. I would not trade Bam Adebayo at all if you were the Heat, and maybe it makes sense for them because if they're not going to be... Bam feels like somebody who needs to be on an impactful team because he's just that good, that he's not going to be one of these players that goes to a terrible situation and puts up, 25, 30 points per game. Bam's game is a lot more predicated on his defense. I definitely think he could help be a culture builder if he were to go to... I don't know. Again, I'm not even trying to throw it out there. Like, the idea of him in Detroit or Washington, like, that would be such a waste of his talent. But, he's the one who has the most trade value for them, I would say. And I don't know how this necessarily plays out for them this offseason. I would imagine that they are going to try and roll into next season and be in the market for another one of those star players and just sort of play out this Jimmy Butler situation. But I would have a really hard time willingly paying Jimmy Butler $50 million until he necessarily shows that he is going to be committed to the regular season and such. And obviously he's done a lot of good things for the Heat in the seasons that he's been in Miami. But I think that, from his perspective, it would stink for them if he ends up walking in free agency. But I don't think it would be this entirely, devastating thing in comparison to overpaying him in his age 38, 39 season when he's already shown an inability to really stay on the court and be a reliable piece for them. But let me know what you think about this whole situation. Again, I don't think that there is an easy fix for the Heat. I would imagine they're going to lean in the direction of trying to run it back with some tweaks. But again, feel like a lot of options are on the table for them, but we are going to be taking our final break here, and when we come back, I want to move on to some NFL conversations. We had a report that came out surrounding Kirk Cousins that I wanted to touch on, so stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're going to be wrapping up today's show. I wanted to touch on a little bit of NFL. Obviously, the draft took place over a couple weeks ago now, so we are just about moved on from it, but we do still have stories coming out in particular related to the most shocking move of the draft, and that was the Michael Penix selection by the Atlanta Falcons with the 8th overall pick. And we got a story that came out on Monday afternoon. It was from Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer. Put out a report that part of the reason that Kirk Cousins decided to leave Minnesota and go to Atlanta was because of the fact that, quote, the Vikings were very upfront with the 35-year-old about the possibility that even in the case he stayed, they'd take a quarterback for the future high in the draft. So this idea that he was going to potentially have somebody knocking on the door for his job opportunity is something that drove Kirk Cousins away. Now the Falcons were able to give out more money anyways, or at least were more willing to hand out money to Kirk Cousins, and that was obviously a huge part of the situation. But he seemed to think that he was going to have some more security going to Atlanta, which is why he was, quote, frustrated and confused when they decided to take Michael Penix Jr. with that 8th overall pick. And the fact that the conversation between Cousins and the front office didn't happen until Atlanta was already on the clock. It sounds like Atlanta had Michael Penix as their number 2 quarterback on the board, and I guess to some degree, I mean, Cousins and his agent wasted no time getting the story out that he was upset with the fact that the Falcons decided to go with a quarterback. It was literally, I think that the Bears were on the clock when the story came out. ESPN's Pete Thamel, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He ended up reporting that Cousins' agent had told him about the frustration that he didn't know until they were on the clock. So if that was going to be sort of the gut reaction anyways, and granted, because they waited this long, there was definitely some feeling of betrayal. But if you are the Falcons in this situation, you're trying to keep it on the low that Michael Penix, it was their number 2 overall prospect or at least quarterback prospect in this draft, that they didn't want that potentially getting leaked and having other teams use it against them. But at the same time, I don't know. It's a very interesting conversation in terms of the ethics behind being a general manager and when you key your players in on certain types of situations. And they ultimately decided that they weren't going to tell Kirk Cousins, but that was clearly a contentious point for him, and he had expected them to use that 8th overall pick to try and help improve the team for the upcoming 2024 season. So, again, all of this to be said, the Michael Penix Jr. situation is going to run into the regular season and is going to, it's really difficult, I feel like, for Kirk, because it's one thing if he's in Minnesota and he's led them to a playoff win and he's been here all of these seasons. It seems like the locker room was really bought into Kirk Cousins there in Minnesota, and if he or the team is struggling, maybe there are some people clamoring for his job, but he at least sort of has a backbone in the franchise in the area to have some level of support. He's now going to be walking into Atlanta where, it seems clear from their front office that maybe they didn't even necessarily seem to believe that they were quite to the level of contention that a lot of people were hyping the Falcons up to be when they made the signing of Kirk Cousins. And they have no real attachment to him. It's not like he's not a star necessarily in the NFL where he has all of these, accomplishments throughout the course of his career, like in Aaron Rodgers going to New York. And it just feels like there are going to be a lot of people probably pretty quickly ready for Michael Penix Jr. that want to see this exciting upside of who was one of the most electric players in college football. Again, I've been consistent on that. Do I necessarily think he's going to be a tremendous pro? I have my doubts, but at the same time, he was super exciting in college, and he has all the arm talent to be able to potentially be a pro here and be a good pro, I should say. He already is technically a pro, but I can understand the level of betrayal. Also, the fact, though, that he was willing to, and not just willing to, wanted to leak the story about how upset he was just minutes after the pick was officially announced, that, he is definitely very uncomfortable with the situation, and the fact that he did so quickly is only going to make it a bigger story when training camp and the regular season all kicks off. So it's going to be just a very contentious situation there. Now, the Falcons feel comfortable that they're going to be able to make it work for the immediate and the near future. I believe it was GM Terry Fantano who said that part of the thought process behind this, besides the fact that they fully believe in Michael Penix Jr. as a quarterback in the NFL, is the fact that they felt like they dropped the ball a little bit, not having a succession plan for Matt Ryan. And obviously the past couple seasons have been pretty disastrous for the Falcons from that quarterback perspective. Marcus Mariota was benched about halfway through the year in 2022. Last year, I feel like, was one of the worst situations that one of the worst QB rooms that I have ever seen personally. As far as a day one plan, like obviously when Aaron Rodgers goes down on the first drive of the season, that hurts if you're a Jets fan, but there was at least a plan that you could have one of the greatest of all time playing the position. Never saw it with Desmond Ridder. Taylor Heineke, as much as he was fun when he led Washington to that playoff run in, 2020? 2019? I think it was 20. But for them, it just felt like they never really had a legitimate plan that was going to put them in a real level of contention. And as a result, their defense actually overachieved, and they still won 7 games, which was great. But one of the most dysfunctional red zone offenses that we've seen in the league in years. And it's coming from a Patriots fan who has also seen his fair share of red zone disasters in recent times as well. But, I understand the thought process behind wanting to make sure that you aren't left sort of rudderless from a quarterback position. You are bringing in this older quarterback coming off of a serious injury, that you want to make sure that you do have some type of backup plan. But again, the way that they sort of went about all of this is a little bit suspect to me, and I just don't think that it was greatly executed. And again, I don't know necessarily when the right time would have been to bring up to Kirk Cousins that they were planning on drafting a quarterback. It definitely wasn't during free agency itself. I mean, maybe they could have put out, feelers saying we're high on a couple guys in this draft and we are potentially looking into it. They were obviously trying to sign Kirk Cousins, though, so they wanted to entice him to come into the building and sign with the organization. So definitely could have hurt their chances, but it at least would have led to a little bit less drama. And I feel like there would be nowhere near as much questions about this selection. Again, I wouldn't necessarily love it myself from my evaluation of Michael Penix Jr., but it would be far more defendable than some of the other moves we saw, like Bo Nix being taken by the Broncos at some point. Again, you might not love the quarterback prospect, but I can understand the idea of, especially when you're talking about quarterbacks, the NFL draft can be such a crapshoot. Just take a swing. You need the position, address it, and see how this sort of plays out. I think that there would be far less scrutiny if they hadn't just given Kirk Cousins $100 million guaranteed, plus I think another $80 million in the contract as a whole, even though I highly doubt that the contract ultimately is going to fully live up to the deal. Still not sure how this is going to play out for them. Terry Fontenot had the quote talking about it's a good problem to have. If we don't see Michael Penix Jr. for 4 or 5 years, that's a good thing. Not necessarily. I mean, it's just a total waste of this rookie contract. And now the Packers sort of walked a thin line with this, and it ends up, at least seemingly, is going to work in terms of the situation surrounding Jordan Love. They didn't get him on his rookie deal for most of his first few years. Last year, they signed him to a pretty team-friendly 2-year deal, meaning he's now eligible for an extension again, and he is going to get paid. Now, he, in theory, again, pulled off enough to show that he is worth the money, but they weren't able to necessarily reap the benefits of having a quarterback on that rookie contract. The number one example I always go to is the fact that, of course, Brock Purdy has been the biggest bargain for the 49ers they could possibly ask for over the past couple seasons, and it's allowed them to surround him with so much extra talent, and why they've made the NFC Championship 2 years in a row and were in the Super Bowl last year in overtime with a great chance to take down the Chiefs. But I don't know. Let me know in the comment section how you feel about it. I feel like it's probably the last time we're going to be talking this situation for some time. We've hammered it a lot lately, but wanted to at least sort of get this new report sort of out in the air and talk that through. But again, let us know what you feel in the comment section. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on weekdays, so be sure to catch us out. Check us out on YouTube, where we post the clips of our entire shows here, not just myself, but the other shows we have here at the GSMC Sports Network. Check us out on social media for more exclusive short content. Like, follow, subscribe, wherever you keep up with us. And we will see you tomorrow. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn it.